Hi, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. This is Kim Churches. I'm AAUW CEO, and I am so pleased to welcome you today to what I know is going to be a robust, challenging, and interesting conversation about iterative thinking and active listening, how we can get to common ground in a time of polarization and vitriol, not just here in the United States, but around the globe as we deal with massive social issues, climate, and so many more topics. Let me first give you a little bit of framing of how we're going to lead today's discussion. And honestly, everything is in flux. The pandemic has its peaks, its lows. It's changing on a daily basis because human behavior and viruses don't always act exactly as we plan. We have racial and systemic racism and justice movements. That reckoning that we are all just beginning to start to really face in this nation and beyond, of how we can break down structural racism and really help to have a lifelong journey to improve the abilities of all human beings, not just to survive, but to thrive in every society. We have millions of human beings still out of work. We know we can't just return to the old normal. So what we're going to be talking about today is how innovation, active listening, and iterative thinking can help us bridge divides, whether they're socioeconomic, gender-based, racially based, intergenerational divides, etc. And how can we actually meet people on common ground on major issues, even when it seems we're at polar opposites. So our panel of experts are going to be sharing real-world examples of how they get to this and what major changes they see afoot. I do want to expressly say at the outset that how grateful we are at AAUW for the support of API for this webinar and several others in our effort to really get to a common ground and how we can continue to all be, as I always say, lifelong learners. This was an example for me just this past weekend when my father-in-law, who's quite elderly, who shares very different views than I do, we got in a spirited conversation over the weekend where I was trying to really meet him, stand in his loafers and meet him where he is on his thought patterns, just so I could understand where we are. And it was very hard for him, though, to come and meet me in that intergenerational divide on a couple of topics of interest for us both. I also recall when I was at the Brookings Institution and we had folks dealing with energy and climate policy. And really you'd have everything from Greenpeace to ExxonMobil trying to find common ground of where we could meet. And in some areas it came to carbon tax and how we could actually find commonality in certain areas as we discussed energy and climate for our planet. So I do want to make sure and welcome everyone for joining us this afternoon. I am now going to introduce today's panelists. We have with us today Aaliyah, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, Aaliyah, and I'm so glad you were able to get in. Aaliyah Quintana, who's the Director of Stakeholder Relations at API, where she leads API's Energy Action Alliance with strategic partners really focused on workforce development and engagement, which I find very interesting and I hope we'll get into, with non-traditional allies in the oil and gas industry. Prior to API, she was the Vice President of Corporate Relations at Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility, where she managed key relationships with Fortune 500 corporate members to really strengthen and advance the organization's overall mission, bringing awareness to Hispanic representation in corporate America. She additionally, in addition to her bachelor's and master's degrees, she also studied abroad extensively in many, many countries: Costa Rica, Spain, Italy, Mexico, China, where truly she's become a global citizen with a greater aptitude for global economy and international relations. I also want to welcome Lina Cañon, who was born and raised in Bogota, Colombia. She truly has a passion for engaging in social change efforts, which started in her early days in her undergraduate work at Suffolk University. And she's currently the Associate Director at Chica Project, a Boston nonprofit working to close the opportunity divide for young Latinas and women of color. But in addition to that, she's also an entrepreneur. Lina is the co-founder and chief operating officer for the NER Collective. She most recently became a fellow for the Philanthropy Connection, Mendoza Ventures, and graduated from the Institute for Nonprofit Practices Boston Leadership Cohort. Welcome to Lina. And we also have with us today Nachari Riley. She's a mixed methods researcher and designer whose core mission is to use data to create impactful experiences that center people's lived experiences. And she works on this from working with customers for a Fortune 500 company to really looking at this and reimagining how we can work in cross-discipline collaboration. She uses an interdisciplinary blend of science, technology, and design to create unique experiences which are going to drive meaningful and lasting change for human beings. So today, she leads design research on federal COVID-19 response projects at Wondros, infusing data-driven insights into impactful campaign assets, outreach, and strategy. Welcome to you. And finally, we have Melody Yashar with us, who's calling in, if you can believe it, to everybody in from Hawaii today. And thank you so much, Melody, for joining us. She's a designer, technologist, and researcher, and currently is the director of building design and performance at Icon, a startup developing advanced construction technologies to shift the paradigm of home building on Earth and beyond. Her current work really focuses on relationship of advanced software and hardware systems for spaceflight. Having come from that truly interdisciplinary background, she's appreciating how research and design are a confluence of different fields, allowing problem solving to become much more collaborative, which we'll talk through today as we're dealing with all of these different areas. So, Aaliyah, I'm going to start with you first, if you don't mind, and thank you so much for the support of API for really challenging all of our thinking to have this important conversation on iterative thinking. But tell us a little bit, I'm really intrigued by the work that you do to engage non-traditional allies in the oil and gas industry in your role at API. What commonalities are you looking for to identify groups to engage with? And how do you enter those initial conversations when things can feel perhaps vitriolic or at least polarizing with so many different views?
Yeah, well, thank you, everybody, that's on the panel today. Really look forward to hearing from, different voices, and also, AAUW for, giving us this space to speak about important issues that, are certainly relevant more than ever during, this pandemic that we have experienced, which more than ever, the just divides, right, of women that are, having to decide about, the challenges of working from home and also, being able to carry your career. As far as, the role that I have at API, so my upbringing, I grew up in a very, I'm not sure if many people are familiar with Kern County, Bakersfield, which is completely fields, oil fields everywhere. And so the irony is that, I come from a very underserved community, also born outside of the country. I was born in Mexico. And so for me, not only do I represent, those underserved communities, but, now that my role at API, I have really been able to work with a lot of very, strategic partners that that commonality that we're looking for specifically is those that are not necessarily in the industry, working in the industry. So, and what we mean by that is, many folks may obviously realize that the majority of the industry has been male, white, for a very long time, and so we have a huge retiring workforce that's happening within the next 10 to 15 years. And so, the research that we have done over the last 10 years really dictated that, if we wanted to continue as an industry, we really needed to do huge investments, on those that weren't inside, working for the industry. And that's how a lot of these initiatives, kind of came around. And I would say diversity, equity, inclusion for many companies has existed. Member companies of API has existed for 40, 50 years. But as specifically stakeholders, this is a unique opportunity to be able to change the perceptions, bring awareness, talk about the industry in so many ways that are, important to those that are not necessarily familiar with the industry. And so the commonalities we're looking for is workforce, diversity, equity, inclusion, education, equities, all of those type of things that are important, to address on these folks that we want them to come work for us. And so that's, how my role, it has evolved at API. And, I'm very excited to continue the conversation and share more.
Thanks so much. Thanks very much. Melody, I'm fascinated by your work. I want to hear a little bit more about how you combine research and design, which I said in my opening here is how you describe as a confluence of different fields. What, in your view, is the path forward or the key to getting to common ground or to collaborative problem solving as you think about bringing together things that might seem disparate in wording, but then come together? How do you think about this?
It's such a great question. And I'll start by saying thank you to AAUW for putting together this excellent panel and for facilitating a conversation on these topics and on common ground and how we can find it in today's age. A little bit about my background. So I work at the intersection, like you said, of design and technology. So I work for a startup based out of Austin, Texas called Icon that focuses on large-scale 3D printing solutions for homes. So we focus on affordable and resilient and accessible housing solutions that can address the needs of multiple markets, be it disaster relief, be it for communities in need and for social housing, as well as for market rate housing. And in doing that and in working as a designer within this field, I inevitably am at the intersection of multiple technology development initiatives. So my team and the group that I lead is architecture and building performance, but we collaborate and we work hand in hand with material science, hardware development, software development, and construction, all of which are engineering, and in the case of construction, frankly, like traditional and very risk-adverse areas that do not historically represent women, and women are not historically represented in these fields. So in my experience working with the external partners that we have, and even working internally at Icon, my experience has been that facilitating open communication amongst all collaborators is really the key to understand multiple perspectives, and establishing a value system where others can be heard and where your voice is also acknowledged is one of the key elements that I work towards in this highly collaborative and innovative field, which really has not, like what we're doing has not been done before. So that's another thing that I try and keep in the back of my mind, is that this is a new paradigm. We're introducing a new building system that has not achieved regulatory or certification approval. And we have to think things over and do things right this time, because it's the first time it's really being done. So none of the pressures and I guess you could say burdens of what's a stereotypical construction, let's say manager, or a stereotypical engineer, or a stereotypical technologist really apply. I try and keep an open perspective, and I try and keep an open mind in regards to what I think is fair, equitable, and what is going to represent the needs of not only myself, but also our company most adequately. That's what I'll say.
That's great, and it's fun to be thinking in a new space where you're working off a blank sheet of paper too, so that it's like there's not just one path to solutions, but there could be many. So you've got to meet all of those various stakeholders where they are and hear them out, because any one of them could be the path towards success, and that you get to take an entrepreneurial frame of mind to it. Really interesting, Melody. Thank you. Lena, I'd love to, first off, I love that you've got a day job, but yet you're still hustling and creating an incredibly important new work with the NER Collective. I'm particularly fascinated, and I hope we can get to some of we talked about this in the green room before we open it up to everybody. I'm a white cisgendered CEO leading a 140-year-old organization, currently with staff that are baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Generation Z, and soon to be post-Generation Z, all that are coming at it with their own lived experiences, geographically, socioeconomically, racially, culturally. And so how we can get to these types of conversations, is meaningful and important for me many times to come at it with open-ended questions first. But I'd love to hear at the NERC Collective a little bit more about how you're facilitating these intergenerational dialogues, and maybe kind of if you can share a little bit more on some of the shared lived experiences that the collective's participants have been really powerful in connectivity.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I echo everything that everyone has said so far. What a powerful panel we have here. I think one of the most successful things that the NERD Collective has done has used language to redefine the way that we talk about things. And I think traditionally, language is really powerful because even going back to the initial question of how do we challenge a narrative? Well, we start by changing the words that we use to create the narrative, right? And so the NERD Collective in particular said, we are a collective for first generation identifying folks. And immediately people were like, okay, first generation immigrants or the first to go to college? Got it. That's the definition of first generation. And we were like, well, the experience is very different. Even as I heard you highlight some of your identities, I'm sure that you were the first in many spaces, even though you are not the first woman in power or you are not the first woman leading a company. And in that, there's the intricacy of your identity, right? So the first thing that we do is we are really intentional with the way that we define words that existed before us, but that we are redefining for ourselves. First generation being one of them. And the way that then we actually get to talking about them, right? Because definition and having the wording is one, but then it's like, how do you actually engage in conversation? I think the second one is we really adopt a learner's mentality. And this is particularly tricky when it comes to lived experience, because an example, myself, I've been a nonprofit for 7 years and I just graduated from business school. So while I can say that I have a lived experience in being a nonprofit, so I know what it's like, and I now have graduated with a master's from business school, I know what that's like. That only speaks to my lived experience in both fields. So I am not by any means a master of all of these academic spaces. And at the same time, I know a little something because I lived it. I was part of it. And so owning both in a really good balance of saying like, hey, here's what I'm an expert at, and I know that for sure. And at the same time, I'm always showing up as a learner because my experience is just mine, and yours, while you could have literally lived the same life as me, and I'm sure you all have siblings or people that you relate to that are like, how did we end up so different if we lived the same thing? Or how did we go to that one place and come out with different things? It's because we're all very different. So owning that balance of what am I an expert at? What can I own and really stake in? And what am I learning at? And when it comes to people, identities, culture, and dismantling systems of oppression, we are always learners because there is always more to learn. And then the third one is just showing up with that learner mentality and honing in on the human experience. And I think that was one of the biggest learning moments when we had our NERD Collective opening party, like our grand launch, right before COVID made us not have any more events. In January of 2020, we opened it up. We said, anybody who identifies as first generation, come. And we had an intergenerational crowd that came from, retired business folks from India to interns, young college students, to white working professionals, to Latino immigrants. And they were all in this room like, what do we all have in common with each other? And the way we led the conversation was saying, what identifies you as first generation? And so as folks started adding labels to themselves, right? I'm a first generation immigrant. I'm a first generation LGBT. I was the first to come out in my family. Or a young white man saying, I was the first to leave my Mormon community, right? They're all very different experiences. Like they're not by no means the same experience, but they have the same themes, which is being the first. And in being the first, there is a struggle of that lived experience of how do I then deal with my identity as I reject what I have grown up in? How do I then deal with redefining who I am and what I mean by stepping into my identity? And how does that then work in the world that is constantly transitioning? And so that was really important to us while we own our labels and while we own our identities, to also strip away from the things that makes us different and really hone in on how we felt while we navigated the first generation experience. And you would have, I was amazed to see all of these folks who I never would have imagined had so many similarities share the same feeling, the same sentiment, and the same struggles as they navigated their first generation. So that would be the third one, always honing in on the human aspect of how things make us feel, because at the end of the day, that's really what drives what we do and the things that we create.
I mean, really, just beautiful, Lena, and so true. As disparate and as different as we all can seem, those commonalities, we can find them, and greatly appreciate all that you've just shared. Thank you. Nachari, I am really interested in your work, and really want to learn a little bit more. You know, here at AAUW might be based in DC, and you guys are hearing you're hearing my dog. This is the reality of Zoom, right? Somebody's making a delivery, so this is real life. There's the delivery. But you combine research and design to advance your work, and are really data driven. We at AUW too believe that facts matter, even as we live in Washington, D.C., where sometimes facts can seem a little crazy in our world right now. But we really believe that you start with a baseline of facts, you develop and analyze from that, and then produce policy and pragmatic solutions. So I want to hear from you a little bit more, if you can share with us how you use data to inform outreach strategies to engage diverse audiences, and tell us a little bit more, and even maybe a couple examples you can share with us, because I think your work of really using mixed methods is truly interesting.
Thank you for asking that question. And it's also a very interesting one, because while it's more and more you see a lot of organizations focus on data-driven processes and also outcomes. And one of the things that I want to underscore before I get into more of the details is how common, or the commonality in all of what our panel is discussing, from making sure that people feel heard, to also figuring out what we have in common. And I use that blend of qualitative and quantitative data to inform that. And it's something that I remember when I was in Zambia, and I was a health advisor, research advisor under a research initiative, under the Global Health Initiative, realizing, because I was collecting every data point that I was recording as well, each record was a person. So understanding that, oftentimes when people see data or see reports, they see these numbers, and it produces this disconnect. And it's like, oh, okay, well, 57% of whatever reported, of this population reported this. And it's easy to kind of, even, especially if the data is contrary to your own views, to then other that data and say, oh, well, take that with a grain of salt, because it, got to work on those issues. And one of the things that I like to remember are that those are, that is reporting the aggregate of people's stories, or what people are perceiving, their needs, sometimes their concerns or fears. And so it's something that I like to keep in mind. And one recent story, as I'm doing a survey analysis right now, so a lot of the projects that I've been working on have privileged me to use my background in epidemiology as well as research and design to work on federal COVID-19 response initiatives. And so in my most recent initiatives, and balancing the in-depth interviews with our quantitative data, which spans, it's multi-state, some being as large as, tens of thousands of people, and some being in the lower thousands. But one of the things that I like to do, even in just designing a study, a quantitative study, is really figure out how you can actually tell people's stories, and what are some of the ways that you can use the data to meet their needs and really address some of the things that they're working on. So one of the things that you pointed out in my bio was in terms of outreach. And so what we do is we work with it at my team at Wondros. We work with our different work streams, for instance, our community engagement team, to really understand what's going on based off of their perception, because they're experts in moving people to take action. And so it's been a challenging time these past few months on different COVID-19 initiatives, especially sponsored by the federal government, to move people to vaccines and other therapeutics. And really being able to understand people's needs. If we're running a survey, it's critical for me to get the different work streams involved in even designing the study. What are some of the things that they would like to explore? What are some of the unmet questions? So when they're having a conversation in one location, does that mean that it is in other locations as well? What are some of the commonalities in those locations, or what are the subtle differences that we can then explore and target? And so I put that in the studies that I design. And then while we're launching them, when we get the data back, that actually, much to the not dissatisfaction, but like to some of our clients, I'll say it's the continuation of questions that we have. So when we get the data back, it's a snapshot in time of what people are thinking. So for instance, if you have people who are on the fence about a particular treatment, you might want to also explore the barriers that they're facing and then fine tune that point. But then you'll notice you're going to get into more of the whys. So that's where we're able to use our other teams to have those intimate conversations with people. And that's also something that we're noticing on many of our projects. It's moving the needle while this is a very this is a time of friction and tension. And so while we can focus on what divides us, we can also focus on the commonality. So thinking of different people that are trusted. Who are the trusted voices? Who are the people that you listen to? Do you listen to these people more than these people? Then, let's work on how we can resolve these issues rather than think about the things that separate us.
Yeah, and you just said that so beautifully there in summarizing that in this time of friction and tension, how do we build trust and who do we trust? And that is so huge. I'd also just want to go back to your earlier comments too on that blend of qualitative and quantitative, because when we only look at aggregated numbers, whether it's percentages or whole numbers, it doesn't get to the storytelling of all of those individual humans and what are those trends. And we can only get that through the qualitative or the storytelling side of it to really get a sense of where people are. Very, very difficult work you're doing, and I'm very grateful you're embarking on it. So thank you so much, Nachar. I appreciate it. Let me get back to Aaliyah here, who kicked us off, because you mentioned that in the API community and in an oil gas industry that has been largely employee-based wise, a lot of males in the industry, but that a lot of the companies as a part of the organization, have been focused, as you said, on DEI for 40 or 50 years. That said, I think we know for a lot of organizations, nonprofit sector, not just for-profit sector, but for-profit sector, public sector, nonprofit sectors, have been using also a lot of lip service around DEI and frankly around JEDI of saying we care about that, but a lot of it ends up being hashtags and social media or press releases and not always getting to substantive and lasting change in employee conduct, in managerial decisions, et cetera. So, as you're looking to really engage both kind of traditional and non-traditional allies in the work and knowing how fast energy and climate is literally changing as we're seeing this tumultuous, not only have we had the pandemic, but we've had a lot of crises on our planet and here in the United States over the past year too. Can you share, around either the DEI side or around some of the awareness you're building in these conversations? Can you share any examples of what API or your stakeholder companies have been doing to kind of both bring these groups together, or some examples of things that you think are starting to work where you're reaching? There's a comment in the Q&A, which we can get to, about how do you have tips about how to deal with someone who's actively expressing anger and really, really disagrees with your point of view? How do you meet them where you are? And I'm sure I see Lena nodding as well, that we've all had that experience on something, sometimes at our own family dinner tables, right? It's not just in our work. So maybe if you can share a little bit about bringing some of those examples, and also just some tips on how to meet people where they are, even when they're actively expressing their displeasure towards you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's something that's always a little bit of an awkward silence. I certainly have very close, living in DC, I have tons and tons of great activists, everything from environmental to educational, you name it, from the whole spectrum. And so, look, these are real conversations and real issues that are impacting our families, our communities. And, if we can't have real dialogue, if we can't have those honest conversations, how are we going to come to a real solution, right? And I think that's always my take on on the industry that I represent. And I go down to, specifically when we were talking about a lot of lip service and a lot of, obviously programs that have been in existence for a long time, but I want to share a little bit of the challenging barriers and the perceptions within the industry. We have found that through various studies that the National Survey of Women found that about 3% of the women that had applied to work in the oil and gas industry, only 3% of women have typically applied. Another barrier that has been part of it is also many of them don't even consider employment within the oil and gas industry, or about the number of men outnumber the number of women. Typically there's 4 to 1 that are getting degrees in oil, natural gas related fields. So certainly those are like some very challenging barriers or perceptions of the industry that we will, in order for us to change the D&I of the workforce, we need to increase the number of women and women of color actually getting those type of degrees. And so there's many opportunities on that. And I think especially when it comes to education, we want to make sure that we're innovative. And API certainly has when I first joined them, which was almost 3 years ago, our CEO came out and said, climate change is real, which, a lot of folks, even myself, now being in it, working with API for 3 years, but being a partner prior to that, I've been working with them close to almost 10 years now, have really seen a lot of the initiatives that they have been doing around climate change. They rolled out what is called the climate change framework. We also work a lot on the safety standards. So a lot of folks just have a lot of perceptions of the industry that, I wish that many other industries would follow, as far as when it comes to the climate change initiatives. I'm working collectively with all the member companies. Right now we have a partnership that's called the Environmental Partnership. It's about 100 different global companies that are coming together, pledging on specific, climate change initiatives, that it was way before, we had perhaps, some of the new policies that are coming through the new administration. And I think that this is, in order to come to a solution globally, we need to really work with developing countries as well. And so I think that, there's so many things that obviously the industry needs to do, whether it's the investment in the education for early, STEM education, to really ensure that the future workforce is ready to enter into this, but also changing those perceptions and having those real conversations with community stakeholders so that they understand that we need solutions, and working separately is not the adequate way of doing this. And so I'm passionate about these issues. I love certainly when you talk about tree huggers and things like that, I would say I'm one that is constantly I have a 1-year-old now, teaching her a lot of things like that. And so there's a lot of people like that work in the industry that are passionate about those communities, and we need more people of color and more women to come and be part of these solutions so that we could be part of these long-standing problems that we need to ensure that our future generations could actually have a bright future ahead, right?
Really well said. Really well said. And I think that also gets to somebody put into the chat, like, want to make sure we don't just stick on generalities, but some specific examples of how we find some commonality, or to be able to have conversations with people that have different viewpoints. And actually, Nachari, she's also, I'll have you jump in on this too. She's asking, like, what is she finding might convince somebody who's anti-vaccination to consider possibly a vaccine? And I think you touched on that of really on, who would build the trust, who are the voices that they might trust, what are the facts that they could share to do some of that trust building in different communities. I can just say for me, there is a book I've used for about 25 years called Fierce Conversations. And really it's about getting to, using the proper I statements, we statements, rather than you do this and I do that, but that I feel that I'm not hearing you fully, and open-ended questions. So a lot of times, I mentioned that I had a difficult conversation with my father-in-law over the weekend on an issue that we are truly at polar opposites. But I had to, instead of yelling, you have to get to, I say, I hear you, I hear where you're coming from. I understand why you feel this way because of your lived experiences here in the United States. But let's talk about, what should that look like? What would be a new roadmap to you? If you were able to make these decisions, what would that path look like to you? Or have you heard of this, that, or the other? And that really helped to ensure that his voices were heard, but he also got a chance to hear from me. And I did it really from that position of I, rather than how dare you, you're wrong, you're crazy, how could you think this way? But really sharing it from my own lived experience. And he, he could hear that more. And it was a much calmer. And I recall, many, many years ago, Michelle Obama saying that when you sit at people's kitchen tables, you realize how close we all are, which really gets to what Lena talked about earlier too. Melody, in the questions here we do have, and thank you so much, Elliot, for sharing your comments. Melody, there's a couple questions here because I think people are just fascinated on a little bit more on your work here. And because you're really you're setting what you're working on at ICON is cutting edge and is different. It's kind of turning construction and development upside down and reinventing it. There's a question here, if you can speak to innovative construction that addresses disaster mitigation issues, as we're seeing more and more and more intense natural disasters. And how do we get to, a lot of people, location, right? And housing for every socioeconomic level in our nation. And so how do you think about construction in mitigating some of those disasters as well, and how that gets to maybe finding common ground in solutions too?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great question. And it really does get to the heart of what it is that ICON as a company is providing and what services we're providing, and the product, I like to refer to it as a product, we're providing to the world that is actually changing the paradigm of construction overall. So ICON is developing a wall system, a 3D printer that can develop concrete-based wall systems that are constructed for the time being within the immediate Austin area, but in the future in other jurisdictions as well. We're focusing on disaster relief housing and designing resilient homes because we do not see stick frame construction as a sustainable and reliable way of moving forward and building resilient and long-lasting, durable, robust structures for the future. And so that's our general focus within hurricane-prone areas, tornado-prone areas. And more so than that, the thermal mass that we actually are able to accomplish using a more robust wall that's made out of concrete is going to preserve energy and is going to, it results in a more energy efficient home. From the homeowner's perspective. So in the long term, we're thinking about sustainable operations for the home buyer, which is not something, and it's not a value that's typically promoted within construction. Construction, typically speaking, is about lowering costs right up front when it comes to labor and materials. But for us, we're very invested in actually the energy efficiency of our homes as we're providing them to our homeowners. Beyond that, concrete is actually a fairly sustainable way of approaching materials waste in construction. Typically, there's something like a metric of over 4 tons of materials waste and construction-related waste associated with home building in the United States every year. By using a very automated and precise system to deposit material only when it's needed, we're looking to reinvent the way that materials waste are actually thought about, and the life cycle of materials are actually thought about in construction. So these are kind of our more high-level value adds that we're providing as a technology company to the construction industry overall. I do want to return back to some of the earlier points that were made in terms of finding common ground with others when it comes to D&I and when it comes to inclusion within the general narrative of what it is that we're doing. The fact of the matter is that we are still a small company. We don't have the kind of agency that larger corporations have to actually have, I guess you could say, broad sort of say or authority in education and also in the future of, let's say, the job market within our industry. We're still only a company of 99 people. So from my perspective, it's also very important at every level of our group and of our organization to be promoting opportunities that can bring students and can bring others in from the outside so that they can be part of this larger narrative of what it is that we're trying to create and the vision of the future that we're actually trying to promote in rethinking these ideas having to do with construction and home building. So we do our part in trying to make sure that we're embedded within universities. Personally, I try and establish relationships with architecture studios and construction management related courses within our immediate area so that women and people of color and other minorities are actually able to see themselves within a position in a company such as our own. And I don't think that outreach happens nearly enough. It's something that I'm fully invested in, and I hope to see other smaller companies and smaller startups engaged more in that kind of practice.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Melody, for sharing. We are getting a few questions here too, around tips on how to deal with folks who maybe are not explicitly hearing you or hearing each other. And so I want to dive into that since we're talking about active listening, iterative thinking, and getting to common ground. So I'll lay out a couple of ideas, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lena first, and then Nachari to give their comments here. But some ways in which I'm right now working in gender equity, and I can tell you that in the cesspool that is social media, when I tweet out some things or post some things on LinkedIn or other places, many times I can get just horrific direct messages, as I'm sure you all have witnessed or received in some way or another, or heard of others who have. And so how do you actually engage or not engage? And so first, if I'm sitting down with people who have differing points of view, it's really sharing that, I feel tremendously sad that we're in conflict on this. And I'd love to hear your story. I want you to tell me a little bit about about yourself and why you're passionate about this viewpoint. And I'll tell you about myself. And I hope that we both can come at this with open ears to hear one another and find those commonalities. And honestly, a lot of times, no matter what, in the case, we find that people have more commonalities. They might just use different nouns, verbs, or adjectives to express it. But if you listen hard enough and think about synonyms, you can probably get a little bit closer. I'd say also a lot of times, like I said before, is asking open-ended questions. Well, what was that like? How did that feel? How did you manage that? Why did you choose X, Y, or Z? So again, calmly and with grace. And I can't emphasize that enough, that it's great to say, using grace in this, that we're going to lead first with a deep breath, exhalation, and try and engage. And when you do find a topic that might be on a level playing field, really pursue that so you can build some trust together. And we might, you might be able to say, hey, we disagree about pay equity, or we disagree about religion, or we disagree about education in the United States. But how do you feel about making sure the next generation is here to take care of us all as we age? How do you feel about the changing demography of this planet and also of this nation? And how is that going to change maybe some of our old norms in doing things differently? But I put in the chat too the name of the book that I had suggested earlier, which is just one I've used for a long time. So I hope that helps a little bit. So let me turn to Lena first, and then Nachari, to see if you both want to lean in on that, because I know when people see the title of this type of webinar, they want to go, golly, it is great to talk about it with some of this, but sometimes things just get too heated. And how do we make sure that we are really hearing each other and can connect in a way that can be productive? Lena, your thoughts?
Absolutely. I'll start off with, I remember when I was in college a bit ago, and I was saying, like, I want to graduate and make change. One of my professors said, start with your household, start with your closest circle, and then work out. So all of us can think of a dinner conversation that may or may not have happened during Thanksgiving or the holidays, where that emotion does come in. And I think that that's a great grounding example for how heated it can get. So if it can get so heated with the folks that we're supposed to be affecting the most because they're in our circle and we already have trust and we have history with, imagine with the world, right? And I resonate with what you said about putting on social media, because the other reality is that this next generation is not being as I don't want to say humble, but as gracious, using the word grace that you use. They're not being as gracious to the learning journey of many folks. So they're coming with cancel culture, and they're coming with calling you out, and they're coming with absolutely not, we will not accept anything but using our pronouns when we speak, but calling me by the name I'm supposed to be called. And so knowing that that's the world that we're navigating, I think a couple of things that I can offer is, the first one, absolutely leading with inquiry. I love the concept of coming in as a learner and everyone being a teacher to each other. However, I recognize that as many of my identities that I hold, first generation immigrant, first generation college and graduate student, first generation entrepreneur, it is also not my responsibility to teach folks. And that is like the biggest thing. And so as you can lean in to be a teacher and ally, the first thing that I would say is ask the tough questions, whether they be, tell me more about where that statement came from, or what made you think that, right? I think the other reality is that we live in a moment where we are so polarized and also so hypersensitive, because we're constantly ingesting more information, and we weren't meant to learn this much stuff on a daily basis. We weren't meant to be the experts on every issue and how to combat that issue, but here we are. And so my number one would also be preserve your peace. You don't have to be the teacher. You also don't have to engage in the conversation, and find the right source and the right ally. For a lot of companies, they have HR folks who are now taking DEI into effect. I do some, like, to the point of the side hustle, I do some side consulting, helping companies understand how on all levels they are failing the very much values that they are saying that they're embodying, right? And that starts from asking questions like, what does your social media look like? Or why did you think that that was an okay email to send? And then in regard to the polarizing and how to tackle questions, take the emotion out of it. I always, every time that we enter a scenario that there is tension and that we see that there is anger and emotion, which is valid, that is the first thing that we do. We validate folks' experiences. I know we've touched base here, but folks that come from Latin communities, in particular women of color, like, are very, very valid in their distrust of the medical system in this country and the testing that has been done. So validating that experience and also asking a real question, what is your concern now? Right? Like understanding, putting that, and I think for a long time, this country wanted to just like not even talk about what happened and move on to fixing it. But the reality is like, we need to take that moment to say this did happen, right? Like it did happen. System of suppression exists because of that. And what and how can I contribute to it moving forward? And then lastly, the last thing I'll say, and this was a tweet that I saw that I want to take part of, is preserve your energy. At the end of the day, these conversations will continue to happen. This learning journey will continue until long after we're all here. So preserve your energy, exit the meeting, exit the room, make yourself a priority for these conversations, because they can be tolling. And especially for folks of color who have been put in the forefront for teaching this, it's not your job unless you're actually getting paid for to engage in those. So those would be my couple of tips.
Incredibly well said. Totally true. And preserving your energy. And I know I saw a couple of questions too about what else can we do to be better allies. And I just say, sometimes it's being directly in the conversation, as you're suggesting, Lena, and sometimes it's stepping back and continuing your own self-learning journey through watching and learning more about systemic racism, about polarizing issues in our country and on the planet, and learning more yourself so that you can show up as a better ally. I say it every day that it's a lifelong journey for me in continuously learning to be a better ally and to work on these issues every day. But that also requires self-care, as Lena just really beautifully put. Nechari, your thoughts, and then I know I'll turn back to Melody and Elia for closing comments as well.
Yeah, I will make this very quick. I personally haven't, personally and also through my work, haven't necessarily dealt with angry responses, and a huge part of that is in the method that I choose to hold guided discussions with people, and so that method includes asking people about themselves and asking people questions that are not laced with my own values, so that I can learn more about them, and then also learn what they're motivated by without me projecting my own thoughts and feelings into it. And that's actually one of the scariest things for people that I speak to when I do interviews, because they're like, "What answer do you want?" And I'm like, "I just want to learn more about you." And in this time, it's very interesting to see that be the pattern. It's like, this isn't what I was expecting. It's like, we're just having a conversation, and you see the conversation evolve, where people are able to tell their honest feelings and not necessarily seek out the social proof, like, I know that this is not what I'm supposed to say, but, and they'll tell you more things that are on their mind. And that's where they start letting their guard down and start giving you more of the inner reasons why they're thinking those things. So that's the key approach, very similar to the other panelists on
Really
and
well
you,
said.
right?
Really
Yeah.
well said, because if we just build surveys, right, people are going to try and give you the answer that they think you want, exactly as you said. And so you have to keep digging deeper. That's beautifully put. Melody, I know you've got a hard stop too, so I want to be respectful of your time. Any closing comments you want to make on your work in finding common ground before you have to jet several time zones away from us here in Washington, D.C.?
I would second Nachari's comment, which is that oftentimes we don't perceive our own background and our experience as an asset because it just hasn't been part of the narrative to date, or depending on the discipline that you're in. But I would encourage everybody to see their disparate, discrete experience and their background and their voice as something to be celebrated, because it absolutely lends itself to a richer working experience. It lends itself to introducing new ideas, innovative ideas that can change the status quo. And that's exactly what in industry, and also frankly in research, is what's needed to propel advancement in new areas and to bring new ideas to the forefront. So celebrate yourselves and make sure that you're in an environment and you're in a culture that actually rewards that and it acknowledges that.
Very, very well said. And I can say it too: is none of us are Clydesdale horses. In a Budweiser commercial, we can remove these shields here and really open up our aperture to be hearing and seeing all different viewpoints. Very, very well said. I am going to turn it over to Aaliyah, and I'm also going to share my screen here because API has a different way for us to learn a little bit about how they're engaging with allies as well. But Aaliyah, closing comments today on this important topic?
I just want to thank everybody, for the great questions, and invite them to our API Energy Citizens, which is an advocate grassroots webpage to really help those that are passionate about the oil and gas industry to keep it reliable, clean, and affordable. I invite those to go to here, and thank AAUW for giving us this platform to participate as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much to API for supporting AUW and for being partners with us in this journey. I do want to thank all of our panelists. Melody just had to jump off, but she said, feel free to connect with her on LinkedIn as well to stay connected on her work and her journey of really solving complex building, construction, and homing in new ways. Special thanks to Nechari, to Lena, to Elia for this incredibly robust and important conversation. We didn't solve it all today, but I know that we are all coming away with a few tips that can help us to engage in difficult conversations, but really hope to and strive for common ground so we can get to lasting solutions. I want to remind everyone that today's webinar was recorded, so you'll be able to find it on the AAUW website at aauw.org in about 3 to 5 days. If you've got any questions or feedback, you can hit up my dear friend and colleague Tremaine Parquet at parquet@aauw.org. I know he would love to hear your comments. And I just want to say thank you again. I have learned a great deal. We are living in incredibly scary times, but also incredibly opportunistic times. Let's look at this more as opportunities rather than weaknesses. Let's look at what is facing us as challenges in a way that we can improve society for everyone and ensure that we're moving forward and not backwards. And I thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you all for being with us, and we'll see you on a webinar again soon.